a peace treaty hung by a thread, sealed with an arranged marriage Emperor Ronan never wanted. But when his iron-scarred hand rose to pull back the ivory veil inside the Cathedral of Thornspire, the gasps of 1,000 nobles swallowed the sacred silence whole. The woman trembling before him was not his bride. She was something far more dangerous. The northern empire of Vargath was not a land that forgave weakness. It was a realm of obsidian peaks and snow-buried forests, where winter arrived without warning and wolves ran beneath moons so large they seemed close enough to bite. The rivers froze solid by the first breath of autumn. The passes between mountains became walls of white silence that swallowed entire battalions whole. The people who survived in Vargath did not merely endure the cold, they became it. And at the crown of this unforgiving empire, rising from the frozen plateau of the Black Moon Ridge like a fist thrust into the sky, stood Black Moon Citadel. Emperor Ronan stood on the upper rampart of the citadel's eastern tower, bare-chested despite the biting wind, watching the grey light of morning crawl across the mountain range below. He was enormous even by Lycan standards, nearly 7.5 feet of bone and muscle forged by 2 decades of war. His dark hair tied back from a face that carried the architecture of violence, a jaw like carved stone, a nose broken twice and reset poorly, and eyes the colour of deep amber that had seen things no diplomatic treaty could ever undo. Scars crossed his torso in pale, silvered lines. Some were thin and surgical, dueling scars from formal challenges in the early years of his reign. Others were broad and ragged, the work of southern steel during the campaigns in Eldoria's eastern valleys. The worst of them ran from his left shoulder to his ribs, a wound from silver-tipped arrows during the ambush at the Ashfin River. His healers had told him it should have killed him. He had told them to stop talking and stitch it. 10 years of war had left Vargath victorious in battle and hollow in everything else. The granaries were half empty. The training yards were full of boys whose older brothers had not come home. 3 generations of noble families had sent sons north and received ashes back. His armies had never broken. His empire had never fallen. But Ronan understood, with the grim clarity of a man who had stood in too many fields of dead, that winning a war and surviving it were entirely different things. You look as though you're preparing for an execution rather than a wedding, my emperor. The voice came from behind him, low, measured, carrying the particular patience of a man who had spent 15 years learning how to deliver unwelcome truths without losing his head. Ronan did not turn immediately. "Perhaps I am," he said. Cale stepped out onto the rampart, a heavy ceremonial mantle folded over one arm. He was Ronan's beta general, shorter than the emperor by a full head, broader in neither shoulder nor jaw, but with the kind of stillness that made lesser men uneasy in his presence. He had survived 4 major campaigns, a poisoning attempt in Ronan's 3rd year of reign, and the particular daily challenge of serving an emperor who communicated primarily through silence and controlled menace. He held out the mantle without comment. Ronan took it. The fabric was southern woven, deep charcoal wool edged with black fur, embroidered at the hem with Vargath's twin wolf insignia in silver thread. It smelled faintly of cedar and foreign craft, nothing like the wood smoke and iron that clung to everything in the citadel. He pulled it over his shoulders and began fastening the clasps with deliberate slowness, as if delaying each one bought him something. "Lord Aldrich offers me peace wrapped in a wedding vow," Ronan said finally. "We both know what it actually is. A leash," Cale agreed, without softening it, "but one that secures the southern passes and ends the bleeding." He fell into step beside the Emperor as Ronan moved back inside, ducking through the stone archway that opened into the upper corridor. "We have lost 43 senior Lycans in the last campaign season alone. The pack healers are reporting transformation sickness in younger warriors. They're shifting under stress before they're ready. The war has taken a toll that victory tallies do not measure." Ronan said nothing. He knew the numbers. He had memorized the numbers the way he had memorized battle maps, not because he needed them in front of him, but because forgetting them felt like a betrayal of the dead. "Lady Celeste of House Aldrich," Cale continued, in the tone of a man reciting intelligence rather than making conversation, known across Eldoria as the Jewel of the South. "Daughter of Lord Aldrich, one of the most powerful human nobles below the Thorn Wall. The marriage secures an alliance that opens trade through the Meridian Gate and guarantees a generation of undisputed border peace." A pause. "She is also, according to every courier and spy we have sent south, extraordinarily difficult." "Good," Ronan said flatly. "I would not respect a woman who wasn't." Cale allowed himself a small expression that stopped short of a smile. "She has reportedly dismissed 3 previous betrothal arrangements, publicly insulted the Duke of Halvorn at a state dinner, and once described the northern Lycan territories as, and I quote, a very large, very cold mistake. Then she and I will understand each other immediately. They descended the main staircase together, the wide stone steps worn smooth by centuries of armored feet. The citadel was already alive with movement below. Servants in formal black and silver livery crossing the great hall in careful, purposeful lines. Lycan warriors in ceremonial armor taking up positions along the processional route. Banners bearing the twin wolf sigil of Vargath hanging from the rafters beside the unfamiliar gold and white standards of Eldoria. The smell of candle wax and southern incense drifted up from the lower levels, incongruous against the permanent cold stone scent of Black Moon's walls. Ronan paused at the foot of the stairs. Through the tall, arched windows of the hall's eastern face, he could see the lower road that wound from the citadel gates down toward the cathedral of Thornspire, where the ceremony would be held. The cathedral had stood for 300 years at the foot of the ridge, a massive structure of pale stone and coloured glass that the old builders had constructed at the exact point where northern and southern territories had once met. Neutral ground, sacred ground, today common ground. The southern delegation arrived before dawn, Cale said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Lord Aldrich and his household, 20 knights, a full retinue. He paused. The bride's carriage came through the gates an hour ago. Ronan stared down at the cathedral road. Something moved in the back of his awareness. Not thought, not strategy, but the older, deeper sense his wolf carried. A low, unformed unease, like a sound heard from too great a distance to identify. He had learned long ago not to dismiss that feeling. It had saved his life twice in open battle and once in a corridor at midnight. He dismissed it now. Today was politics, not war. He was wrong about that. Below, the great bells of the Cathedral of Thornspire began to ring. The bride had arrived, and something in Ronan's wolf stirred, not in recognition, not in welcome, but in the ancient bone-deep language of warning. Before we continue, to all our returning listeners, thank you for coming back and sharing these stories with us. And to those joining us for the first time, we're so glad you found your way here. If you'd like to support the channel and enjoy special member perks, consider becoming a channel member. We'd be honored to have you as part of our growing community. The Cathedral of Thornspire had been built to humble even the proudest man. Its ceiling soared 40 feet above the nave, ribbed with pale stone arches that caught the light from 100 suspended candles and scattered it in trembling fragments across the floor. The windows were ancient colored glass, deep blues and blood reds depicting the old gods of north and south, in uncomfortable proximity, as if even the cathedral's builders had understood that peace between these two peoples would always require something sacred to hold it together. Today the space was full to its walls. Southern nobles occupied the left rows in silks and velvets, their colors warm, golds, creams, deep burgundies. They held themselves with the precise, practiced composure of people determined not to appear afraid. Many were. Ronan could smell it from the altar, the sharp, particular scent of human anxiety poorly disguised beneath expensive perfume. On the right, Lycan warriors and northern nobility stood in ceremonial armor and dark furs, their stillness the watchful kind. Several of the younger wolves kept their eyes on the human contingent with an alertness that had nothing to do with celebration. Old war instincts did not vanish simply because a treaty had been signed. The Bishop of Thornspire stood at the altar, a thin, white-haired human in ceremonial robes that pooled at his feet, his expression carrying the particular strain of a man tasked with presiding over something far larger than religion. Ronan stood before him and felt nothing approaching peace. He had positioned himself with his back straight and his hands loose at his sides, the ceremonial mantle sitting heavily on his shoulders. Cale stood 3 paces behind him and slightly to the right, close enough to serve as witness, far enough to be discreet. The amber of Ronan's eyes had gone very still. He watched the cathedral doors at the far end of the nave and waited. The processional horn sounded. The doors opened. The bride entered. She moved slowly, too slowly for ceremony, Ronan noted. Not the measured, deliberate pace of a woman making an entrance before 1,000 witnesses. Something else, something effortful and careful, like each step required private negotiation. The ivory wedding gown was elaborate, layered silk and heavy lace that swept the stone floor, long sleeves that covered her arms entirely to the wrist, a veil so thick it rendered her face completely invisible. She carried a bouquet of white roses that trembled visibly with the movement of her hands. His wolf stirred again. Ronan kept his expression still and watched her come. She was slight beneath the gown. That much was clear even at distance. The celebrated Lady Celeste was reportedly tall and golden and moved, according to every account, with the confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her own welcome in a room. This woman walked as though she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Her shoulders were drawn forward. Her veil moved in small, shallow rhythms that spoke of breathing kept deliberately controlled. 20 feet away, the scent reached him. Ronan's entire body went quiet. Not perfume. Beneath the layers of southern fragrance, the rosewater, the incense worked into the fabric, the cedar of the gown's chest. Beneath all of it, something else. Something that did not belong in a southern noblewoman's wedding preparations. Rain, pine resin, and beneath that, barely present, almost scrubbed away entirely, the cold metallic edge of old fear. Fragments hit him without invitation. Rain hammering stone, the smell of rotten iron, silver chains that burned where they touched his wrists, his throat, the bones of his hands. Darkness so total he had tracked time by the sound of water dripping through cracks in the ceiling. The absolute certainty after the third day that no one was coming. Then a sound, soft, careful, a door that should not have opened. A shape in the darkness, small, trembling, smelling of pine and rain and terror so acute it had nearly matched his own. "Hurry, please. There isn't much time." Ronan blinked. The bride had reached the altar. She stopped beside him and did not look up. This close, the trembling in her hands was unmistakable. The bouquet shook against the front of her gown. A gap had opened between the lace at her collar, a small thing, barely noticeable, and through it, at the edge of her neck where silk met skin, the yellowing edge of a bruise pressed outward like a secret trying to surface. The bishop began the ceremony. Ronan heard none of it. His wolf had gone very, very still in the way it did before something irrevocable happened. And so, by the ancient bonds of treaty and the witness of both gods and men, the bishop's voice rose toward its final cadence. Let the groom now unveil his bride, that both kingdoms may bear witness to this union. Silence collapsed over the cathedral like snowfall. Ronan raised his hand. His fingers found the edge of the veil, ivory lace cold to the touch, and he drew it back slowly, the fabric whispering against itself as it rose. The gasps came first, a sound like a single inhalation shared by 1,000 people simultaneously, drawn from every corner of the nave. The woman before him was not Lady Celeste. She had dark hair, damp at the temples, a face that had once been striking and was still, beneath the exhaustion and the shadow of old damage, quietly beautiful. Hazel eyes that had gone wide with something past fear, the specific expression of a person who has long since stopped expecting mercy and has arrived here anyway. A brand mark curved at the base of her throat where the collar had hidden it. Her lips parted. "Please," she whispered, so low only his wolf could catch it. "Please don't send me back." The world narrowed to the space between them. Rain, pine, silver chains. A shape in the darkness, trembling, pressing a key into his burned palm, with hands that shook just like these. Ronan knew her. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the cathedral came apart. The sound was not a single voice, but a collision of them. Southern nobles rising from their benches. Lycan warriors shifting forward with hands moving instinctively toward weapons. The bishop stepping backward with his ceremonial scroll, clutched to his chest like a shield. The colored light through the windows continued falling across the stone floor, indifferent to the chaos beneath it. Witchcraft. Lord Aldrich's voice cut through the noise, with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He was on his feet in the front row of the southern contingent, a tall, silver-haired noble whose face had been arranged into an expression of magnificent outrage. His hands were raised, his rings catching the candlelight. He was exactly the kind of man who understood how to fill a room with his indignation, and he filled it now completely. Lycan sorcery. He moved into the aisle with the measured urgency of a performer who knows exactly how long to pause for effect. "My daughter, Lady Celeste, of House Aldrich, the promised bride of this treaty, has been replaced through dark northern magic. This is an act of deliberate treason against the peace accord and against the sovereign dignity of Eldoria." Several southern knights had moved to the edges of the nave, not drawing weapons, not yet, but positioned. Ronan noted them the way he noted everything in a room that had become a battlefield. Behind him, Kale had gone absolutely still, also watching, also counting. Mira had not moved. She stood at the altar with her bouquet held against her chest like something to hide behind, her eyes cast downward, her breathing too controlled for a woman who was not actively preparing to die. She believed she already knew what came next. The Emperor would confirm the outrage. He would step back. He would let the southern nobles have her. And whatever they did after that would be brief and final, and she would at last be finished with all of it. Ronan looked at her for one long moment. Then he looked at Aldrich, and the full shape of it assembled itself in his mind with a cold, complete clarity that battle had trained into him across 20 years. The understanding of a trap not from the outside but from within its mechanism, seeing each piece and where it connected and what it was designed to produce. Aldrich did not want the treaty broken. He wanted Ronan to break it. He wanted the Emperor's hands on a servant girl in front of 1,000 witnesses, wanted the fury and the violence and the dead body at the altar that would give every southern lord who still profited from war exactly the excuse they needed. The mock outrage, the position knights, the woman chosen precisely because she was disposable, because no one would ask difficult questions about a branded servant. It was elegant in its way. Ronan could almost respect the architecture of it. He did not move for a long moment. In that stillness, the fragments came again. Not gently this time, but with the full weight of sense memory. The smell of that prison had been specific. Stone that had never dried. Silver ore in the walls that made the air itself feel hostile to Lycan blood. The restraints had been designed by someone who understood precisely how to immobilize a shifted wolf. Silver-threaded chains that burned continuously, that prevented transformation, that left the skin beneath them raw and weeping. By the third day he had stopped pulling against them. By the fifth he had understood that his body would eventually fail. On the sixth night, a door had opened. She had been perhaps 19, a servant. From her clothing, rough-spun dress, no shoes despite the stone floor, her dark hair escaping a loose braid. She had carried a single candle and a ring of stolen keys, and she had been shaking so badly the keys rattled against each other in the dark. She had tried 3 keys on his chains before the 4th opened the first restraint. She had not spoken except once when he had asked her name. Don't. If you don't know it, you can't give it to them. She had guided him through service corridors for 2 hours in complete silence, her hand on his arm, a slight warm pressure steering a giant through darkness, and had left him at an exterior door that opened onto a ravine. By the time he had turned to look back, she was already gone. He had never learned what happened to her afterward. Now he knew. Ronan turned from Aldrich to face the altar. He stepped forward, 1 step, placing himself between Mira and the cathedral full of noise and calculation, and the movement alone silenced the nearest section of the crowd. He was, when he chose to make his size felt, a genuinely terrifying presence. He chose to make it felt now. His voice when it came was not raised. Did not need to be. She is my bride. The noise in the cathedral dropped sharply. She was presented before this altar. I have lifted the veil. The ceremony has reached its completion. He turned his eyes to the bishop, who had gone the particular color of old parchment. By the ancient law of Vargath, the rite of the open altar, any bride received by the emperor before witnesses becomes bound to the imperial house. Regardless of name or origin, a pause. The bishop's mouth opened, closed, then quietly. The law stands. Ronan turned back to face the cathedral. She is my empress. Lord Aldrich's manufactured outrage flickered, just once, just briefly, into something that was not outrage at all, something that recalculated. Then he bowed, deeply, his face reconstructed into gracious defeat, and began moving toward the cathedral doors, with his retinue folding in around him. In the shadow of his turned back, hidden from every eye in the cathedral, except the 2 Lycan guards closest to the door, who would not know what they were seeing, the corner of Aldrich's mouth pulled upward. The wedding trap had failed, but the wedding trap had never been his real plan. Mira had been inside prisons that looked like rooms before. She knew the logic of them. The soft bed that was still a cage, the meal that arrived before the questions did, the kindness that preceded the cost. Lord Aldrich's household had operated on precisely that principle. Comfort extended, then withdrawn. Hope offered, then used. She had learned, across years of service in that house, that the shape of a place meant nothing. What mattered was the door, and who held the key. So when the carriage passed through the gates of Black Moon Citadel and she was led, not dragged, not shoved, led, through a corridor of pale stone into a wing of the citadel that smelled of wood smoke and medicinal herbs, she did not allow herself to feel anything about it. She catalogued it instead. Wide corridor. 2 guards at the entrance, Lycan, armed but not hostile in posture. Stone walls hung with dark tapestries that reduced the cold. A fireplace at the far end of the room she was brought to, already lit, burning high. A bed with actual linen. A copper basin of steaming water on a side table. She stood in the center of the room and waited for the condition attached to all of it. Sit, please. The chair nearest the fire. The woman who entered was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair pinned severely back, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now simply authoritative. She carried a leather case with the worn, competent look of a tool used daily for decades. Her eyes moved over Mira once, not unkindly, but with the clinical attention of someone accustomed to assessing damage quickly. I am Lady Seraphine. I hold the position of Royal Healer to the Imperial House of Vargath. She set the case on the table beside the basin and opened it with practiced efficiency. I have been asked to examine and treat you. You are not required to consent, but I would prefer that you did. It tends to go better for both of us. Mira sat. She consented because the alternative required energy she did not currently possess. What followed was conducted with extraordinary gentleness and complete professionalism, which made it in some ways harder to endure than roughness would have been. Seraphine worked without commentary and without flinching, which Mira had learned to recognize as the mark of someone who had seen worse and chosen, deliberately, not to perform shock for the benefit of the patient. The brand at her throat. 3 cracked ribs, 2 partially healed and 1 recent. Lash marks across her upper back, layered, old silver lines over older ones. The malnourishment that had softened her cheekbones and left her wrists narrower than they should have been. The yellowing bruises at her collarbone and the fresher ones at her arms, where she had been gripped and positioned into the wedding gown 2 days prior. Seraphine dressed and wrapped and applied and said nothing until she was finished. Then she said quietly, "How long?" Mira looked at the fire. 7 years. Seraphine closed her case. You will need 2 weeks of rest, proper feeding and daily treatment for the ribs. The brand will scar. I cannot change that. She paused at the door. There is food coming. Eat slowly. Your stomach will not tolerate volume yet. She looked back once. You are safe here, child. I recognize that means nothing to you at present, but I wanted to say it regardless. She left. Mira stared at the fire for a long time without moving. The political response to the new empress arrived before the week was out. It came not as confrontation but as atmosphere, the particular chill of a court rearranging itself around an unwelcome fact. Lycan nobles who passed her in the corridors, with their eyes directed precisely above her head. Conversations that stopped at a threshold she had not yet crossed. A formal petition, delivered to Ronan's council chambers on the 3rd day, signed by 7 noble houses, questioning the legal validity of the right of the open altar when applied to a human commoner of no documented lineage. Ronan returned the petition unsigned with a single line appended in his own hand. The law does not consult preference. Mira heard about this second-hand from one of Seraphine's assistants and filed it away with the same careful neutrality she applied to everything. She was not ungrateful. She understood with the precise political literacy that years of invisibility in Aldrich's court had given her, exactly what Ronan's declaration had cost him internally. She also understood that gratitude was not the same as safety, and that a man who had claimed her in a moment of principle was not necessarily a man who had thought through what came after it. She began, cautiously, to observe him. He visited the healing wing on the 4th day, not announced, not formal, appearing in the doorway with the slightly awkward quality of a man who had intended to check whether something was being managed correctly, and found himself uncertain of the protocol. He asked Seraphine 2 questions. He looked at Mira once briefly, with an expression she could not immediately categorize. He left a stack of territorial maps on the table outside her door the following morning. No note, no explanation. She spent 3 hours with him that afternoon, reading the southern border annotations with the focused attention of someone who recognized several strategic errors immediately. She did not mention this to anyone. On the 7th night, she woke before dawn from a dream she did not remember and sat at the window with her knees drawn up, tracing the raised edge of the brand at her throat with 2 fingers in the dark. An old habit, a private inventory of damage, something she did when the silence became too large. She did not hear the footsteps in the corridor outside. She did not know anyone was there until the shadow shifted in the gap beneath the door, pausing and went still. She turned. Through the gap, she could see the outline of boots. Very large boots, motionless. He had heard her crying. She hadn't realized until that moment that she had been. He did not knock. He simply waited, long enough that Mira had time to wipe her face and pull her sleeve down over the brand, long enough that the choice to open the door or not became hers. She recognized the consideration in it, the same way she had recognized the maps left without explanation. Ronan, she was learning, communicated most honestly in the things he did not say. She opened the door. He looked at her once, the amber of his eyes steady and without the performance of not noticing. Then he looked past her at the room, the dying fire, the untouched water glass, the window she had been sitting at, and said nothing for a moment. There's a room 2 floors up, he said finally. A study. I go there when the citadel becomes too much. A pause. If you want to be somewhere other than here. It was not an order. It was not quite an invitation. It was the particular offer of a man who understood that sometimes the only remedy for a bad hour was a different room. She followed him. The study was small by the Citadel's standards, a square room lined with territorial maps and campaign records, a table scarred from decades of use, 2 chairs before a fireplace that Ronan lit himself with the efficiency of long habit. A wolf slept in the corner, enormous and grey, who opened one eye at their entrance and closed it again. They sat. For a while neither spoke. The fire built itself up between them, and the wind moved against the shuttered window, and the wolf in the corner breathed slowly, and the silence had, surprisingly, no demand in it. Then Ronan said, I remember everything. Mira looked at him. The prison at Ashford, the chains, the door. His eyes were on the fire. I remember your hands, the keys, the corridor that smelled of river water and old timber. He paused. I remember what you told me when I asked your name. Don't. If you don't know it, you can't give it to them. The words arrived in her memory in her own voice, 7 years younger and rigid with fear. I tried to find out what happened to you, he said. Afterward, the scouts I sent back came with nothing. A servant girl, unrecorded, no family name. Aldrich's household denied any knowledge. A muscle moved in his jaw. I concluded you had hidden yourself successfully. I told myself that was the most likely outcome. It wasn't, Mira said. She had not planned to tell him. She had planned with the careful architecture of a person who has learned that information is the only currency that cannot be taken away, to keep it. But something about the room, the fire, the sleeping wolf, the absence of an audience, made the calculation feel unnecessary. They found me the same night, she said. Someone saw me near the prison block. I was arrested before dawn. She kept her voice level, the way she had trained herself to discuss it, as sequence rather than experience. Branded as a traitor to Eldoria, sold into Lord Aldrich's household as a bonded servant. The brand was Aldrich's own mark. It meant I was his property under the southern law, unrecoverable, invisible. She paused. I was 19. The fire cracked. Ronan was very still in the way that she had learned in 1 week of observation meant the stillness was doing significant work. I did not know, he said. The words carried a weight that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. You couldn't have. She meant it factually, not as absolution. But she watched something in him receive it as both. How old are you now? He asked. 26. 7 years. He did the calculation visibly, and she watched him do it, and neither of them said what it amounted to. What followed, gradually and without announcement, was conversation. Real conversation. The kind that builds its own permission as it goes. He told her about the prison in fragments, the silver sickness that had followed him for months afterward, the particular humiliation of a Lycan emperor captured and chained in a basement like an animal. She told him about Aldrich's household with the measured precision of an intelligence report, which it essentially was. She had spent 7 years invisible in one of Eldoria's most powerful noble houses. She had heard everything. At some point, the maps on the table became part of the conversation without either of them deciding it. She showed him 3. Lord Varys of Morthane publicly supports the peace accord, she said, tracing a southern province. He is, also quietly, supplying grain credits to Darius's northern operation. These 2 noble houses, her finger moved, both lost revenue when the border trade shifted. They have more to gain from resumed conflict than from the treaty terms. Ronan studied the map with the focused attention of a man recalibrating. How certain? Certain enough that I spent 2 years making sure I was certain. She looked up. I listened to every conversation in that household. It was the only thing I had to do. He looked at her then, not the brief, careful assessments of the previous week, but directly, with the full attention of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time. You are not what anyone in that cathedral expected, he said. No, she agreed. That's what kept me alive. Something shifted between them in the silence that followed, small, unannounced, like a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Neither acknowledged it. The knock came at midnight. Hard, urgent, the specific rhythm of a soldier who has run to deliver something that cannot wait. Ronan was at the door before the second knock landed. The young scout on the other side was mud-soaked to the thigh, one arm bound in a rough field dressing already darkening through. Southern border, my emperor. His voice was stripped to its facts. Breached, Aldrich's forces. They weren't withdrawing. He held out a rolled dispatch. They were repositioning. The War Council convened before dawn. Blackmoon Citadel's strategy chamber occupied the Citadel's northeastern tower. Round room with a vaulted ceiling, walls lined with campaign records going back 3 centuries, and a central table large enough to spread 4 territorial maps across without overlap. Torches burned in iron brackets at intervals. throwing hard shadows across the faces of the men assembled around the table. Kale stood to Ronan's left. 6 senior commanders occupied the remaining positions, Lycan alphas, each of them, scarred veterans who had spent the better part of a decade learning to read a battlefield the way other men read text. They had been roused from sleep and arrived already steady, the way soldiers do when they have been waiting, without admitting it, for the peace to end. Mira stood at the far end of the table. No one had asked her to leave. Ronan had not asked her to come. She had simply followed, and he had not broken stride, and so she was here, the only human in the room, the only woman in a plain dark robe over her sleeping clothes, her dark hair loose, the brand at her throat visible above the collar. 3 of the commanders had looked at her when she entered. None had spoken. Kale spread the scout's dispatch across the center of the table and began. Aldrich's forces did not withdraw following the wedding. They staged a withdrawal, pulled back far enough to clear the border observation posts, then held position in the Morthane lowlands. Our scouts counted 14 infantry formations and heavy cavalry support. He indicated the map. They crossed the border checkpoint at Halvan's Ford 6 hours ago. That's a full mobilization, one of the commanders said. That wasn't assembled in a week. No, Kale agreed, it wasn't. The implication settled over the room without requiring elaboration. The wedding had not been a trap inserted into peace negotiations. The wedding had been cover for preparations that were already complete. Ronan's voice was quiet. Celeste. Kale nodded once. Lady Celeste departed Aldrich's estate 12 days before the wedding, not after, before. Her official itinerary placed her traveling to Thornspire by Southern Road. She never arrived. Her actual route, he moved his finger across the map, tracing northeast, appears to have taken her here, into Darius's territory. The name produced a specific quality of silence around the table. Darius was not an unfamiliar problem. He was a rogue like an alpha who had contested the imperial succession 6 years prior, lost, and retreated north of the Greywood with a loyal force and enough grievance to keep it organized. He had been, until recently, a manageable complication, too strong to eliminate cheaply, too isolated to threaten the Empire directly. Celeste brokered an alliance, Kale continued. We have 3 independent confirmations now. Darius commits his forces from the north, Aldrich drives from the south. Ronan is caught between them. The Empire fractures along the engagement lines, and Darius takes the throne in the chaos. He paused. Lady Celeste, presumably, becomes Empress of whatever remains. One of the senior commanders, a broad, grey-bearded alpha named Vorek, who had commanded the Eastern Front for 6 years, exhaled slowly through his nose. The wedding delay gave them time. Every day we spent managing the political fallout from the veil reveal was a day their forces moved into position. Aldrich built the delay into the plan, Ronan said. It was not a question. It appears so, my Emperor. Ronan stood with both hands flat on the table, looking at the map with the particular stillness that Mira had come to recognize as his thinking. Face, not blank but interior, processing along lines that didn't require expression. The commanders began talking across each other. Defensive positions, garrison strength, the viability of holding the Thorn Wall against a 2-front pressure. The conversation had the productive urgency of experienced men doing the thing they were trained to do, and it filled the room efficiently. Mira listened. She stood at her end of the table and said nothing for several minutes, because she was not listening to the commanders. She was listening to the shape of what they were not saying, the assumptions beneath the strategy, the gaps between what they knew about Southern military doctrine and what they were inferring from it. She looked at the map. She had spent 7 years in Lord Aldrich's household. She had served at his private dinners. She had poured wine while his commanders discussed campaign logistics in the comfortable certainty that a branded servant was furniture. She had memorized everything. The heavy cavalry, she said. The conversation stopped. Every face at the table turned toward her with varying gradations of the same expression. The particular look of men who had forgotten, briefly, that she was there. She did not adjust her posture or qualify what she had said. She simply continued. Aldrich's heavy cavalry is his primary assault instrument. It's also his signature preference. He has used the same basic formation structure in every major engagement for 15 years. Wide front, dense center, designed to generate momentum across open ground and break defensive lines through sheer weight. She indicated the map without touching it. That works on the lowland plains south of the Thorn Wall. It works in the Eldorian Valley campaigns. It does not work in mountain terrain, because the horses cannot generate speed. The formation cannot hold width, and the density becomes a liability rather than an asset. Vorek was watching her with an expression that had moved past skepticism into something more attentive. Aldrich knows this, she continued, which means he intends to engage on open ground. He will try to pull your forces south, off the ridge, onto terrain that favors him. She reached forward and placed one finger on the map. A narrow pass cut between two peaks northeast of the citadel. A thin line on the parchment, easily overlooked, marked only with its geographic designation. Wolf's Hollow. She looked up at the table. Don't go south, she said. Draw him north. Into this. Her finger remained on the pass. This is where we win. The next 3 days belonged to preparation. Black Moon Citadel transformed with the particular efficiency of a fortress that had never fully believed the war was over. Armories that had been maintained, rather than mothballed, opened their doors within hours of the council's end. Forge fires burned through the night. Supply lines were calculated, adjusted, recalculated. Messenger wolves ran the mountain routes in rotating shifts, carrying dispatches to garrisons along the northern ridge and recall orders to the scattered patrol units operating in the Greywood's outer territories. Mira worked from the strategy chamber. Ronan had not formally assigned her the role. He had simply stopped removing her from the room when planning sessions began, and eventually the commanders stopped expecting him to. By the second day, Vorek was asking her questions directly, not warmly, not with any particular acknowledgement that this represented a shift, but with the pragmatic respect of a military man who had decided that accurate information mattered more than its source. She gave him accurate information. She drew Aldrich's standard cavalry formation from memory and annotated its weaknesses against confined terrain. She identified the 3 most likely approach routes based on the army's composition. Heavy cavalry required specific ground grades, specific clearance widths, and a commander who had never once in 15 years altered his fundamental preference for frontal momentum. She outlined the resupply logic, the march timing, the probable order of engagement. She also, on the second evening, quietly identified which of the 3 Eastern Garrison commanders had a brother-in-law in Aldrich's household, and suggested his orders be routed through Kale rather than the standard chain. Kale had looked at her for a long moment after she said that. Then he had rerouted the orders. The tender moment, when it came, arrived without announcement. It was late on the second night. The chamber had emptied gradually as commanders went to oversee their respective preparations, and until only Ronan remained at the table, studying the Wolf's Hollow approach map with the focused attention he brought to everything. Mira sat across from him, annotating a supply timeline by candlelight. The citadel was quiet around them in the way it only got after midnight, the deep, specific silence of a place holding its breath before something large. You should sleep, Ronan said without looking up. So should you. A pause. Something that was not quite a smile moved briefly at the corner of his mouth and was gone. He looked up then, and the candlelight was doing specific things to the angles of his face, softening the harder lines, catching the amber of his eyes at a warmth that his expression in daylight rarely showed. He looked for a moment, less like an emperor and more like a man who was very tired and had stopped just briefly performing otherwise. You've given us a real chance, he said. You understand that? I've given you information, she said. Your commanders are turning it into a chance. Those are different things. Mira. She looked up. Accept the thing I'm trying to say. She held his gaze for a moment, long enough that the silence between them acquired a texture it hadn't carried before, and then looked back at her work. Noted, she said quietly, but she did not immediately return to writing. The army departed at dawn on the third day. 4,000 Lycan warriors moved out of Black Moon Citadel in the grey pre-light, heavily armed, carrying the specific controlled energy of soldiers who had been waiting for orders to stop waiting. They took the northern ridge road, away from the southern border, away from the open lowland terrain where Aldrich's cavalry wanted to meet them, curving east through the mountain passes toward the Greywood's upper edge and the narrow cut of Wolf's Hollow beyond it. Mira rode near the command column. Ronan had come to her an hour before departure. He had stood in the doorway of the strategy chamber with his ceremonial mantle, replaced by full battle armor, dark iron plate fitted to his enormous frame, wolf-head pauldrons, the twin-blade configuration he apparently preferred in shifted combat, and he had told her, with complete directness and no softening, that he wanted her to remain in the citadel. We have a secure room in the eastern wing, he said. Seraphine will be there. Kale is leaving a garrison of... No, Mira said. He looked at her. I know the plan better than anyone in your command column except you, she said. If something goes wrong, if the approach timing shifts, if Aldrich's formation varies from projection, Someone needs to be present who can recognize it and adjust. Your commanders are excellent soldiers. They are not familiar with Southern tactical doctrine the way I am. She held his gaze. You trusted me with a crown in front of 1,000 people when you had every reason not to. Trust me with this. The silence lasted long enough to be a consideration rather than a refusal. You stay behind the ridge line, he said finally. You do not advance until the first phase is confirmed complete. And you take Seraphine's assistant as escort. He's a shifted wolf. He can move you out quickly if the position becomes compromised. Agreed. He held her gaze for one moment longer. Something passing through it that was not strategic and not imperial, and that neither of them addressed. And then he turned and walked toward the courtyard. Wolf's Hollow announced itself gradually. The road narrowed as the column moved into the mountain's shadow, the peaks rising on both sides until the sky became a grey strip above them. The pass was perhaps 40 yards wide at its broadest, barely enough for a standard infantry column to march 8 abreast. The walls were sheer and dark, streaked with old ice, broken at intervals by ledges and outcroppings that the Lycan advance units were already climbing in silence, taking their positions with the patience of hunters. Mira sat her horse at the ridge observation point and looked down into the hollow. It was a perfect trap. It was also inescapably a perfect place to die if anything went wrong. The waiting had a physical weight to it. Then, from somewhere south, distant, reverberating off stone until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, a horn sounded, then another. Then the ground began very faintly to shake. They came in exactly the formation Mira had predicted. The cavalry entered Wolf's Hollow in a wide front, or tried to. The pass accepted perhaps 12 horses abreast before the walls forced compression, and the wide front that Aldrich's commanders had drilled into muscle memory simply ceased to be possible. The formation pushed inward on itself, horses crowding flank to flank. The dense center Aldrich favored becoming not a weapon but a problem. 4,000 mounted soldiers pressing into a corridor that could not hold their width, could not accommodate their speed, could not give them the ground momentum that was the entire logic of their existence as a fighting force. Mira watched from the ridge and felt something cold and precise move through her. She had been right. She had spent 7 years being right about things in rooms where no one was listening, and the sensation of it mattering was almost more than she knew what to do with. Below, the cavalry filled the hollow. Then Ronan's signal horn sounded from the eastern wall. The Lycan units hit from 3 directions simultaneously. From the cliff ledges above the hollow's midpoint, the first wave descended, not charging down the walls but moving with a particular fluid, aggression of shifted wolves in terrain they had spent 2 days learning. They struck the cavalry's flanks before the horses could react, and horses, confronted with wolves at close range in a space too tight to wheel away from, did what horses do. They panicked. A panicking horse in open ground is a problem. A panicking horse in a 40-yard corridor packed with 4,000 other horses is catastrophic. The formation collapsed inward from both flanks simultaneously, the careful military geometry dissolving into confusion and noise, and the specific chaos of animals and men in a space that had suddenly become hostile to both. From the ledges above the hollow's northern entrance, the Lycan demolition teams released what they had spent 2 days positioning. The sound was enormous, a concussive crack of deep rock, followed by the sustained roar of several tons of snow and stone moving down a steep grade with nothing to stop it. The avalanche took the rear cavalry columns and the heavy supply wagons and the escape routes simultaneously, and the hollow became what Mira had designed it to be, a closed box. Ronan was already inside it. He had entered Wolf's Hollow on foot at the battle's opening, moving through the chaos with the contained purpose of a man who had a specific destination. He found it at the hollow's center, where the enemy formation had been thickest and was now most broken. A figure on a massive black horse shifted partially into his wolf form, enormous even by Lycan standards, carving through the confusion with a berserker's efficiency. Darius. He was larger than Mira had expected from the scout's descriptions. Broader across the shoulders than most fully shifted wolves, fighting in the half form that maximized both reach and aggression. The hybrid state where a Lycan retained enough human cognition to choose targets, but enough wolf physicality to be genuinely terrifying. He had killed 4 Lycan warriors in the time it had taken Ronan to cross the hollow floor, and he moved through the battle with the confidence of a man who believed himself the largest thing in the room. He had not yet seen Ronan. Ronan shifted. The transformation in a wolf of his size and power was not subtle. The armor he wore was designed for it, engineered to accommodate the expansion. the articulated plate separating at precise points as his frame extended, as the wolf took over the architecture of him and built itself outward from his skeleton, until the man was entirely secondary, and the wolf was entirely present. The result stood perhaps 11 feet at the shoulder, pale grey, almost white, with the particular mass of a Lycan who had been shifting since adolescence, and whose wolf form had been shaped by decades of combat. The battle around them created a rough clearing as soldiers on both sides registered what was happening and moved back from it. Darius turned. What followed was not elegant. It was not the structured formality of a formal challenge or the clean narrative of a duel between equals. It was two enormous wolves in a mountain pass, fighting with the absolute commitment of combatants for whom losing was not a survivable outcome. They hit each other with a force that shook the ground. Darius was fast, faster than his size suggested, and in the first exchange he opened 3 lines across Ronan's left shoulder that would have incapacitated a lesser wolf. Ronan absorbed it and kept moving forward. He had always fought that way, not around damage but through it. It was the thing his enemies consistently failed to account for, the capacity to continue after the point where continuation stopped making biological sense. The duel lasted 4 minutes. It ended when Ronan got his jaws around Darius's throat, and the rogue alpha went still beneath him with the specific stillness of a wolf that had calculated its odds and found them terminal. Darius submitted. Then, because Ronan had not survived 20 years of war by accepting submissions from men who would re-challenge the moment his back was turned, he did not release him. He held him down and roared once, a sound that traveled the length of the hollow and above it and outward into the mountain air, and the remaining enemy forces, leaderless, cavalry broken, trapped between walls and avalanche debris with Lycan warriors on every elevated surface, made the only rational decision available to them. They stopped fighting. The surrender processing took the rest of the day. At dawn the following morning, as pale light moved across the snow-covered peaks above Blackmoon Citadel, and the fortress gates stood open to receive the returning army, a column of chained prisoners was brought up the ridge road. Mira stood at the courtyard entrance beside Seraphine and watched them come. Near the column's front, stripped of his rings and his magnificent outrage and his carefully rehearsed expressions, walked Lord Aldrich of House Aldrich. Beside him, her golden hair loose and her face carrying none of the composure that songs had been written about, walked Lady Celeste. The tribunal convened in the great hall of Blackmoon Citadel 7 days after the battle. It was not a small proceeding. Ronan had made certain of that. Representatives from every major Lycan noble house occupied the northern gallery. A southern delegation, not Aldrich's men, but the reform faction that had quietly opposed the war's continuation for 3 years and now found themselves, with Aldrich's arrest, holding considerably more influence than they had possessed a fortnight ago, occupied the southern benches. The Bishop of Thornspire sat in the witness position, looking like a man who had decided that surviving this year required extraordinary theological flexibility. Aldrich stood in the center of the hall and said very little. There was not much to say. The evidence was comprehensive. Scout reports, the intercepted correspondence between Celeste and Darius, the testimony of 3 of Aldrich's own household knights who had decided, with their lord in chains, that loyalty had reached its natural limit. The conspiracy unfolded before the assembled witnesses with the remorseless clarity of a thing that had been designed to remain hidden and was now fully exposed to light. The wedding deception, the staged outrage, the pre-positioned army, the alliance with Darius, the plan to fracture the empire between 2 simultaneous engagements and rebuild it under a rogue Alpha's rule with Celeste beside him. Aldrich listened to all of it with the expression of a man who had gambled on a large scale and was now conducting himself with the dignity that losing on a large scale apparently required. Celeste did not maintain the same composure. She stood beside her father, and her face moved through several things: defiance, calculation, something approaching fear, before settling on a cold, fixed silence that was at least honest about what it was concealing. She looked once at Mira, standing to Ronan's right at the front of the hall, and whatever she had expected to see in a former servant's expression, she did not find it. Mira watched her without particular feeling. She had spent 7 years in that household. She had no remaining capacity to be surprised by what those people were willing to do. The tribunal's findings were delivered before midday. Aldrich and Celeste were stripped of titles, lands, and legal standing in both kingdoms, a sentence made possible by the Southern Reform delegation's formal cooperation, which they gave with the speed of people settling a debt they were relieved to finally pay. They would be held in the eastern fortress of Greywood until the renegotiated treaty established permanent terms for their disposition. The hall was cleared by early afternoon. The coronation was held 3 days later. Ronan had offered to make it small. Mira had told him that small would be interpreted as uncertain, and uncertain would be used by the noble houses still processing their objections, by the southern lords recalibrating their positions, by anyone watching for a weakness in the new arrangement as an opening. She had said this with the same precise political literacy she applied to everything, and he had looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of admiration, which was largely indistinguishable from his version of respect, which she was beginning to understand was the same thing. The coronation was not small. The cathedral of Thornspire was filled again. The same space, the same stone, the same coloured light through ancient windows, the same bishop, considerably more confident this time in his ceremonial role, the same assembly of northern and southern nobility, reconfigured now around a different centre of gravity. When Ronan placed the Empress's crown on Mira's head, a circlet of dark iron set with pale northern stones, simple by the standards of southern ceremony, and exactly right by the standards of Vargath, the hall was silent for one long moment. Then the Lycan warriors in the northern gallery struck their fists against their armoured chests in the old salute, the sound rolling through the cathedral like thunder, and the southern delegation rose to their feet. And the silence became something else entirely. Mira kept her eyes forward and her breathing steady and allowed herself, privately and completely, to feel it. That evening, after the ceremony and the formal dinner and the procession back through the citadel gates, Ronan found her on the eastern rampart. She was standing where he had stood on the morning of the wedding, looking out across the mountain range in the dark, the cold moving against her face, the crown set aside in favor of a plain wool wrap that Seraphine had pressed into her hands at some point during the evening. He stood beside her. For a while they said nothing, which had become, over the weeks since the cathedral, their most honest mode of communication. It began as a lie, she said finally, not an accusation, a fact being named. Yes, he said. They put me in that gown to be disposed of. The crown was never meant for me. She paused. None of this was meant to happen. Ronan was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the peaks below them, carrying the smell of pine and cold stone. No, he said, but it did happen. He turned to look at her, and in the darkness his amber eyes were very steady. And I find I have no interest in the version of events where it didn't. She looked at him, something she had been holding carefully, at arm's length, at a manageable distance, in the protected place where she kept things that could be used against her. She allowed, quietly and without her ceremony, to be held differently. Neither do I, she said. Years passed the way peace does, not in dramatic declarations, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary things. Children played in the courtyards of Black Moon Citadel, their laughter carrying up through the tower windows in the long northern summers. The mountain passes opened for trade each spring, and the merchants came north, and the Lycan craftsmen sent their works south, and the border that had once been a wound became a seam, visible still but healed in the great hall on winter evenings, when the fire burned high and the assembly gathered after the evening meal. A bard sometimes sang the old song, the one that had spread through both kingdoms in the years following the Battle of Wolf's Hollow, carried by soldiers and merchants and travellers until it had become the kind of story that children asked for before sleep. The giant Lycan emperor who had agreed to a marriage he never wanted, the servant girl beneath the veil who had once freed him from chains in the dark. The kingdoms had tried to offer Ronan a bride he never wanted. Instead, fate had returned the woman he could never have survived without. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.